Thanks for coming. My name's Alex Mello. I'm a planner with the Mayor's Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development. I work in the Planning and Zoning Division. A lot of you might recognize me if you were here on Monday. We gave the same presentation to the Licensing Commission. Our goal this time is to present the same presentation to potential marijuana establishment operators. So just for a quick show of hands, who is here on Monday? Okay. All right, so we have a lot of new faces, which is good. Like I said, I'm a planner in the Mayor's Office of Planning and Zoning, and we've kind of been dealing with the marijuana rollout process. I've been working on this for maybe a year and a half, and part of that has been going over the state legislation and figuring out what that means for us. We turned that into a couple of legislative items that we've presented to the Board of Aldermen, now City Council, and they've approved 2 items, and now we're formulating our local procedures. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon. So this whole adult use process started back in 2016 when Massachusetts voters voted to legalize marijuana and set up some regulations. In Somerville, it passed overwhelmingly, with 73.6% of those who showed up to the ballot voting to support the measure. So it's definitely an idea that's supported throughout our community. And after the ballot was passed, the legislature took some time to review the regulations, and they crafted their own version of it. Part of those, as most of you know, it established the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, which created a state license procedure as part of that. Those regulations also gave the local municipalities some degree of local control. And something that was different about those regulations is that it required the potential operators to come to terms with a host agreement with that municipality rather than going through the letter of non-opposition process. So as I mentioned, the state gave cities some degree of local control. It allowed the cities to regulate marijuana establishments through zoning and or licensing. And the difference between the two is that zoning concerns itself more with the time, place, and manner of an operation and placing regulations around those aspects, whereas licensing really looks at the operators of that establishment, making sure they're going to be good community partners and making sure that their values align with the city and that they continue to operate the establishments in a manner that is consistent with the public welfare. So in Somerville, we've adopted both of those measures. We've adopted zoning and licensing. The zoning ordinance that we adopted established uses. So we pretty much copied the state in that respect. We've created adult use manufacturing uses, retail uses, testing facilities. All the uses that the state established, we've adopted in our local zoning. We've also adopted specific regulations as it applies to retailers, and I'll get into that a little bit later. We've also adopted a overlay district, and that overlay district prescribes where retailers are allowed by special permit. And the third piece of legislation that we've passed had to do with, it was an amendment to our Code of Ordinances where we created a new licensing procedure, and that's a local procedure that's different from the state. Part of that includes a priority process and certain criteria where the commissioners will evaluate potential applications, and I'll get into that later. So as I was mentioning, our zoning ordinance created uses consistent with what the state created, and our philosophy in terms of deciding when and where those places should be allowed, we really simplified that, and we tried tying it to what were existing uses in our zoning and drawing comparisons. So for example, an independent testing laboratory is going to be treated the same as any other laboratory in the city. I used this analogy on Monday. Essentially, now that marijuana is legal in the state, we're not really concerned whether laboratories are studying scientific properties of coffee or marijuana. They're both legal things as far as we're concerned, so we're going to let scientists do their things. And the same would be true for manufacturers, whether someone's manufacturing microphones or in vape pens or whatever. We're really simplifying things and letting the industry play out in a manner that's consistent with other types of uses. Here's the marijuana overlay district that we approved. You can see it's mostly along our neighborhood squares and corridors with more spaces available in Assembly and Interbell and Union Square. These overlay districts are based on our zoning overhaul. If you're familiar with other things happening in the city, we're in the midst of overhauling our zoning code. And the direction we got from the Board of Aldermen at the time was to allow these in the same manner that liquor stores might be allowed. So this overlay district follows our zoning overhaul, and where liquor stores would be allowed by special permits in those districts. So that's what you see here. The licensing ordinance that we created gave authorization to the Somerville Licensing Commission to issue licenses for any type of marijuana establishment, not just retail. So whether you're manufacturing, testing, or research operation, you're going to need a license from the Licensing Commission. One unique thing that we did with our procedure is we've established a priority period, and those are, that basically set aside a priority period of 2 years where the Licensing Commission can issue no more than 12 licenses, and the only eligible applicants for a license during that 2-year period are either Group A or Group B applicants, and I'll get into those a little bit later. We wanted to keep things relatively simple, so potential applicants are only going to submit what they would be submitting to the Cannabis Control Commission, and we understand that they're going to be applying for a local license first before a state license, so we are only expecting people to submit drafts of that material, knowing that it's not going to be fully fleshed out, and there might be more details that need to be ironed out during the state process. The ordinance that we created also includes some evaluation criteria, like making sure they're good business partners and that their values align with Somerville values, and making sure they hire local residents, things like that, because we really want to do what we can to keep this industry local. And the last part of the licensing ordinance is that in addition to the inspection and compliance checks that the CCC will be doing, it gave authorization to our Health and Human Services Department to also do those inspection and compliance checks. And so those are the two pieces of legislation that we've passed. So now that they've been passed, we had to go back to the drawing board to figure out how our legislation mixes with what the state regulations are. So we've established our own set of procedures, and in talking to the Cannabis Control Commission, they're not going to consider an application until all local approvals are complete. So the process that we have put forward on this slide kind of shows potential applicants having to go through the local process before getting to the state. And in order to start that local process, the first step is going to be to apply for a host community agreement to the city. The mayor has set up an advisory committee to help him evaluate all the different applications that come in. And that committee is made up of 4 municipal officials, the planning director, the director of health and human services, the economic development director, and one of the deputy police chiefs in the police department. So those 4 people are going to review all the applications that come in and make recommendations to the mayor's office, and the mayor's office will make the ultimate decision on who the city enters into a host agreement with. And one thing about the host agreements, they're going to be uniform across the board. All retailers are going to be presented the same host agreement. All manufacturers will be presented with the same one. And they're going to vary because of the state law, and as you all know, there's not going to be any sort of impact fee for the manufacturers because that wouldn't make sense. So if a potential applicant does get a community host agreement, they are then allowed to pursue special permitting if necessary, because there might be some manufacturers that might be allowed in an industrial district, but the retailers are definitely going to need a special permit from either the planning board or the zoning board of appeals, and any type of establishment will also need a license from the licensing commission. So we picture those processes running at the same time because special permitting could take anywhere from 2 to 6 months. So we don't want to hold people back. We want people to be able to apply for their licenses at the same time, knowing that you can't really have an establishment up and running without both processes actually completing themselves. And then if an applicant is successful with getting the local approvals, then they can move on to the state process. And as you all know, there's a two-part process where they issue a provisional license, and then once you get built out and everything, in a couple of days before you're ready to open, they'll issue your final license if everything goes smoothly. So that was a quick overview of our municipal procedures, and as I mentioned, the first step is going to be the host agreement, and those applications for a host agreement will be live by the close of business today, so you can log on to our website. That was on the front slide. I'll just pull it up so people can see. It's somervillema.gov /departments/planning-and-zoning/adult-marijuana. So if you want to take a picture of that, or if you just type in adult marijuana Somerville in Google, this might be the first thing that pops up. But all of our information is there. The legislation I talked about, the application, an outline of our procedures. I still see people with their phones up, so I'll pause. All right. Yeah, so the first step, submitting an application to the Marijuana Advisory Committee. I'm going to serve as a liaison for that committee to potential applicants, so you're going to be submitting your applications to me. And we're going to ask that they be submitted in electronic format, either via email with PDF documents or on CD drives or thumb drives, something that's in the 21st century where we can just easily manage electronic documents. The first deadline is going to be April 5th at 12 p.m. And this isn't the only chance to submit an application. We envision that we're going to have a deadline on the first Friday at noon of every month. And that Monday or Tuesday, we'll compile all the applications. We'll put them together for the Marijuana Advisory Committee, and they can look over that material. And I talked about their ranking criteria, or I didn't, but I will. They're going to be scoring each application based on a set of criteria. It's going to be based on location, physical space, and operations. So location is they're going to be looking at the proposed location, and they want to know, they're going to make sure that it's the best and highest use for the site. It's going to be compatible with the neighborhood. And as far as physical space, they're going to concern themselves with the design. They want to make sure it looks nice, that it has a good flow, and there's no sort of security concerns that are based on that design. And then the third will be operations. They want to make sure that the operations plan is sound, that the operators have a good plan to carry out everything they want to do, that they have a good security plan, They're going to have good hiring practices with competitive wages, hiring local residents, all that stuff. We really want to make sure that the operation is consistent with the community values, and a lot of, that's going to be a lot of what they're looking for. And so after ranking the establishments based on those criteria, they will provide their recommendation to the mayor's office, and the mayor will ultimately, and his staff, will decide who the city enters into agreement with or not. So I touched on the special permit procedure a little bit. Like I said, it could either be the zoning board of appeals or the planning board. That's a function of what the underlying zoning district is. And like I said, we're in the midst of a zoning overhaul, so your underlying zoning district could change. There's going to be public hearings as part of the special permit granting procedure. If you've never been through that, it's a formal public hearing with notice in the newspaper and mailing to property owners within 300 feet. And those public hearings will be actually in front of the zoning board or the planning board, the ones who will be granting the permit. During that process, we also alert the ward alderman or the ward councilor. Need to get used to that. And they may or may not want an informal neighborhood meeting before going to the board. So that could be another potential community outreach meeting that might have to occur. And the special permitting procedures, there's language in there that prohibits retailers from being within 0 and 300 feet of a public or private school providing education from kindergarten through grade 12. And that is not reflected in the overlay district. That's because we're in the midst of a zoning overhaul. And ideally, if the zoning overhaul passes, we no longer have an overlay district. It's just allowed in those underlying districts. And then we have this language in our zoning that prohibits them from being within 300 feet of a school. So if you do have any sort of questions about the site you might be looking at is near a school, you can just give me a call and I can do a quick check to see if the location is good or not. If you are within 301 feet and 500 feet, that is allowed by the zoning. However, the special permit granting authority is going to have to make a special finding that the proposed retailer would not have any negative impacts on the educational activities of that school. And that is something that's similar to what licensing commissions do with liquor licenses when they're near schools. So we're gonna kind of do the same thing for these types of establishments. Another thing is that retailers are limited to 10,000 square feet, and we're gonna compare that parking requirement for a retailer to any other retail sales that we have in our zoning. And you will be required to submit a traffic and parking study. And then the board is also going to focus on appropriate signage. They're going to make sure that it's tastefully designed. They're not going to want any sort of graphical representations to marijuana leaves and things like that. So those are just some things to consider. As I mentioned, the priority license applications, there's 4 types of establishments that will have priority for the first 2 years. Group A is going to have a higher priority than Group B. Group A includes economic empowerment applicants, entities owned by Somerville residents, and in order to qualify for that, at least 50% of the ownership stake is going to have to be held by Somerville residents, and then cooperatively owned entities. And then Group B would be the existing medical marijuana dispensaries that are currently operating in the city. And for the first, like I said, Group A is going to have a higher priority because for the first 2 years, the licensing commission can only issue a license if there's an equal or greater number of active licenses issued to Group A entities. So de facto, the first license is going to be to somebody that is a Group A type applicant. And then from there, there just has to be an equal or greater number of licenses to Group A applicants. Once you So the application for the host agreement is going to be the same application for the local license. So by applying for your host agreement, you're actually applying for your license. If you do get the host agreement, we have your license on file, so no need to resubmit an application. You can just talk to the city clerk's office and talk about scheduling a public hearing if you are successful in getting the host agreement. The application requirements for the host agreement and the local license, as I mentioned before, it's going to be the draft packets of what the Cannabis Control Commission will require. We understand you might not have all of the information ready at this time, or it might be subject to change based on the special permitting process, the licensing process, and the state licensing process. So we're just going to ask applicants to submit information the best that they can to the best of their knowledge based on what they know at that given time. The 3 packets that would be required are the application of intent packet, which is basic information about who's running the business, the source of funding, where it's going to operate. The second one is the background check packet, making sure that the people involved in the operation, looking at their background, seeing if there's any criminal or legal enforcement actions other than marijuana convictions. We're not going to hold that against you. And the third packet would be management and operations profile. This is probably the crux of the application, where we want to know how's it going to operate, what's your timeline for opening, and then some other housekeeping things like liability insurance, making sure you're all paid up on your taxes with the State Department of Revenue. We'll also be concerned about your security plan, storage, transportation, inventory tracking, all that stuff. And ultimately, what the Licensing Commission will be basing your application off of is this set of evaluation criteria. They're going to want to make sure that the operator is in compliance with all state and local laws, that they're consistent to our community values, that they support the local economy through hiring local residents and any contractors that they use being local, and using sustainable practices, commitment to help monitor the health impacts on the neighborhood. And as I mentioned before, we're going to just look at the criminal records, make sure there's no prior convictions for racketeering, basically. We're going to not hold anyone accountable for past marijuana-related infractions. So that's basically how the Licensing Commission will be evaluating the application, and the application will be live by the close of business today. You can find it on our website. If you do have any questions about that, I will be accepting questions in writing to my email address, which will be at the end of this presentation. It's right there. The reason being, we want to make sure that everyone that is inquiring about this has the same access to information, and any email that I get, I'm going to blind copy the people that have signed up for emails, so that you are, I would imagine we're going to get a lot of similar questions on the application form, and if there's anything that we can clear up that we can share to everyone rather than having people continuously asking the same questions, I'm just going to share it that way. I'm not going to be able to have any phone calls to talk about proposed dispensaries or having any ideas run by me, because I will be working so closely with the committee. I don't want to cloud their judgment. They're going to be making their own recommendations. They're going to be ranking the criteria on their own. So we don't want to influence them in any sort of way. So if you do have any questions about this whole process, now's your time to ask them. And I also will accept comments being emailed to me as well. And before I do break for questions, I do want to invite Tom Galagani, who's our Economic Development Director. He will serve on the Marijuana Advisory Committee, but he does just have a couple of points that he wants to plug.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, I'm Tom Galligani. I'm the Director of Economic Development, working in the Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development. We have, as an economic development team and as a city, we're very interested in these Group A applicants, and we're trying to strategize and figure out what we can do to help support those Group A applicants. Again, I'm sitting on the committee, so I won't be able to be involved in any kind of technical assistance, but my staff will be available, and we've set up an information session or a drop-in session on March 12th from 1 to 3 in this very chambers here, so that we can hear from folks about what their challenges might be, so that we can hopefully, with you, help formulate some strategies and some maybe some technical assistance programs. I really don't know what we might be able to do, and I'm interested to hear, or my team will be interested to hear from you and potential applicants to see how we can help. So we'll put some of that information on the website, on Alex's website, so that it's all in a central location. But good luck.
Would my colleagues like to add anything else? Maybe Doug would like to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Doug Kress. I'm Director of Health and Human Services for the city here, and I do have one of my staff members here who will also be attending that meeting, and you can ask questions of Health and Human Services if you have any questions for us. I'm Matt Mitchell, who is my Director of Prevention, so he will be available at that meeting as well and answer questions for you. So thank you. We're looking forward to reading your applications.
Now this is your time to talk and ask me any questions that you guys might have, and if I need to call on my staff, I will. So I guess first hand I see first. Right there. I don't think we want to preclude any local entity from getting help from wherever to help with their application. But in terms of actually being considered a Group A applicant, at least 50% of the people involved in the entity, the ownership of the entity, will have to be Somerville residents. So like I said, if they want to get help from people in California to help fill out their application, that's okay. John? Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. The question was if there's going to be any sort of, do you want to ask it again, rather, so I don't mess it up repeating it back? Okay. Okay. So the question was, are we going to hold anyone accountable for having outside help complete their application, or if they have outside funding that's not local? The answer was, in terms of filling out the application, we're not going to, if you want to seek help from professionals all over the country, that's okay. We're not going to hold that against you. The funding part of it is something that we might look at. The licensing requirement is that 50% of the ownership be Somerville residents. So if, I guess the committee is going to have to determine whether or not, depending on the source of funding and who's involved, if it actually meets that standard of Somerville residents. So that is going to have to be interpreted by the committee. Councilor Scott.
Would you Thank you for the microphone. The intention behind the legislation is that to be eligible as a Group A applicant, that would be a matter of the percentage of equity ownership, and to have that be undilutable, so that it couldn't be simply a front organization or front ownership that applies for the license, and then that equity is diluted by a later balloon payment or something like that. If I need to make that more explicit, I'm always happy to go back and rewrite it.
Yep.
I also advise folks at navigating the licensing process, and I had an accountant recently advise an economic empowerment applicant that I'm working with that she needs to be prepared for someone to come and buy her or offer her a sum for her license. So the question really is there going to be a time frame for economic empowerment applicants? How long do they have to hold the license, or is it going to be transferable?
It will not be easily transferable. If a license is granted to one party and they want to transfer it to another party, it will have to go back to the commission. And as far as how long do they have to exercise a license, the licensing commission can grant a license, but they might not issue it until it's ready to start being used. So kind of like how the CCC has their provisional and final license, where they won't issue the final license up until a couple days before they're ready to start opening. So I would imagine our licensing commission would not issue it until they're ready to start selling. So if a license was granted, but they actually weren't ready to open their business, then it would just never be issued.
Alex, if I may, George Proakis, Executive Director of the Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development. Alex is part of my team and we've been working on this for quite a while. I want to be really, really clear about this point. A Group A applicant has to remain a Group A applicant. If a Group A applicant comes back to the License Commission and says, I want to transfer this license, and the entity I'm transferring it into is a Group B applicant, they're really starting the process over again. So I urge an economic empowerment or a locally owned applicant, don't file an application and come into Somerville saying that you are an economic empowerment or you're a locally owned entity with the intent to flip this thing a year from now to someone who doesn't qualify, because you're going to be back in front of the License Commission and they're probably not going to transfer that license, and that business is not going to be able to continue without that license transfer. These licenses are held by individuals or companies, and we expect that those entities and their ownership are going to remain a valid Group A applicant. So it's very important to establish that it is our expectation that I wouldn't advise anybody to imagine a circumstance where they get a license as a Group A applicant and think they can flip that license to someone else or sell that business to someone who no longer qualifies as a Group A applicant at some point in the future and depend upon the idea that they're going to continue to operate that business, because that is completely at the control of the License Commission. And the rules in Somerville say at all points in time we have to have more Group A applicant licenses, or at least 50% of the licenses have to be in the hands of Group A applicants. So I don't see an easy way to do that.
Back there? Oh, so.
Thank you. So I'm just curious, are you referring to individuals who have the economic empowerment certification or individuals who would qualify as an economic empowerment applicant?
We're going to refer to individuals that would qualify, because we understand that the state closed that window where they will certify people. So if they didn't get in under that time, we don't want to penalize them for not having done so. So we'll do our own certification based on the same criteria.
I'm just wondering what type of proof you'll need to prove for Somerville residency. Like what type of documentation?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be probably different for different people. I mean, we're going to probably review property records. If they say they own a house at whatever, we're going to check to make sure that they actually hold the deed. If they're tenants, we'll probably ask for some sort of utility bills and things like that. We'll continue to ask for information until we're absolutely sure that people aren't just trying to get around that.
Part of the application, sorry. And that'll be part of the application, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And I would work with potential applicants to get that information to us. If they don't, if they're missing something or we need a piece of information, we'll reach out rather than waiting the whole next month deadline, things like that. So we'll work with people to get their stuff in.
Hi. Is there just to be the devil's advocate, is there a period of time during which a tenant will be expected to have been a tenant? Because if you're a big company, you just go out, you rent an apartment, you stick one of the directors in there, get a couple of utility bills, and hey presto, you're a resident.
I mean, yeah, that's something we're going to have to look at. George probably has a good answer for that, having been around.
Sure, certain entities can probably find a way to qualify themselves as Somerville resident owned. My only advice on this would be one of the roles of the staff level committee is to make recommendations to the licensing commission on whether or not we think a package of information provided by an applicant is valid and together and enough to make this. I'm not going to put a definitive line in the sand and say, hey, if you moved here last week versus last year versus 10 years ago versus whatever. I'm just going to say that the more honest and straightforward applications are the ones that are far more likely to be recommended first to the licensing commission. So without saying I absolutely know this makes sense as a local owned applicant or this one doesn't, we'll take a really close look at what that local owned applicant pool really means and where we go from there. Again, I wouldn't advise you to have a director in a situation where they're going to try to move here for a month or two and then move out again, because again, you're going to find yourself back in front of the License Commission trying to explain how you're no longer a Group A applicant if you end up in that circumstance. And it's not just a matter of the License Commission, oh, I came in because I had to update my license. It very well could be a matter of them saying to someone, hey, go investigate this. We heard a complaint that this entity qualified as Group A, but everybody, moved out of state, and we'll look. For those who are here Monday, one thing you'll learn about our licensing commission is we have a person from the police department at every meeting. We have a person from the fire department at meetings. We have people who can figure this stuff out. So honest applications are greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I had a question about the location requirements, just some more detail on the parking requirement, also the distance where it said 301 to 500 feet, the special finding, a little more detail on that, in the type building. Does it have to be a standalone? Can it be in a strip mall? Just some details on those three. I didn't quite hear it.
Yeah, I'll take it one at a time. So the distance between schools, between 0 and 300 feet, it's completely prohibited. And that's measured from the front door of the school to the front door of the proposed retailer. So if you're right on the line, I guess you can skirt it by having your front door be 304 feet away. The special finding, if it's between 300 and 500 feet, is similar to what a lot of local licensing commissions do as it relates to liquor stores. They usually have to make a finding that if a liquor store is within 500 feet, then the licensing commission will have to make a finding that that establishment does not have any negative effects on the educational activities of that school. And that finding in this case will have to be made by the special permit granting authority, which determines on the underlying zoning district. So it could be the zoning board or it could be the planning board. As far as the parking requirement, we are just attributing what every other retail sales, rental, or rental and service parking agreement there is in the city. So if there's a retail store, say CVS, it's going to have the same parking requirement as a marijuana retailer. And is that all? Did you have one more question in there?
The other question I think you had asked was about it being freestanding versus as a part of a mixed-use building, and we have no a strong opinion about that. You know, at this point, I'm thinking one of our medical operators is already in a mixed-use building. One of them is in a building that's attached on at least one side to another retailer. One is in a freestanding building. There's no particular requirement one way or the other on that. So I would urge, based upon what Alex said, there is a little bit more risk going through the zoning process if you're in that 301 to 500 range, and that you have to prove some extra things to the zoning board, which means you may get through our committee process, you may get through our host agreement recommendation, and you may go to the Board of Appeals and not be able to get an approval if they determine that they can't make that finding. Those are the kind of risks that are out there, and that, you know, just considering the site you have to do, I mean, we'll take a look at the sites as we take a look at our recommendations on host agreements. If we know something totally won't fly, we won't send you all the way into the process just to be rejected. But there are circumstances, this did happen with one medical establishment that our committee recommended that couldn't get the approval from the zoning board after we had gotten the other pieces together, because the zoning board just wasn't comfortable with their location. So those things do happen. Certainly, if we select and sign a host agreement with you, we will give you advice on how to reach out to the community and interact with the folks around you and try to do your best to be in a good position to be able to get through the rest of the process.
So I have a question. If I'm going to be a partner with a few members of this community, as a member of one of the communities that is appropriate, there's 29 cities that were made appropriate, I think it is,
Yeah.
because of the impact of the rates of sales and arrests of marijuana. Where would that play a role in terms of this application process for
so
Somerville?
that's one of the criteria to be designated as an economic empowerment applicant. So there's 5 others. If you fall under 2, basically there's 6 criteria. You have to meet 3 out of the 6 in order to be considered an economic empowerment applicant. So in order to be a Group A applicant, you don't have to meet all 3 criteria. It's one or the other. So, yeah. Yeah, over there.
Sorry, I have to ask this.
Yeah.
As an owner, you said can be either be an individual or a company?
Yeah.
Does that mean like an S corporation or a partnership? And how do you determine the ownership in that situation? Is it like if there's voting rights, equity ownership, and income? How do you determine the 50% in that situation?
50% of the equity owners are going to have to be Somerville residents. Yeah.
In your presentation, you referred to the 300-foot buffer for school zones.
Yep.
But is there still a buffer from the distance requirements from other cannabis dispensaries, or are you defaulting to the CCC requirement?
We don't have any local buffer between retailers. So the state's requirements will apply. Any more? If you guys think of any other questions, my email's up there. I'll give you my card if I have cards if you need them. Yeah, just send me an email and I'll get back to you. Thank you all for coming.